Chapter 9. Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lemoyne. greenkri.com. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 9. In the midst was seen a lady of more majestic mien, by stature and by beauty marked their sovereign queen. And as in beauty she surpassed the choir, so nobler than the rest was her attire. A crown of ruddy gold enclosed her brow, plain without pomp, and rich without a show. A branch of Agnus Castus in her hand, she bore aloft her symbol of command, the flower and the leaf. William de Wyvil and Stephen de Martival, the marshals of the field, were the first to offer their congratulations to the victor, praying him at the same time to suffer his helmet to be unlaced, or at least that he would raise his visor ere they conducted him to receive the prize of the day's tourney from the hands of Prince John. The Disinherited Knight, with all knightly courtesy, declined their request, alleging that he could not at this time suffer his face to be seen, for reasons which he had assigned to the heralds when he entered the lists. The marshals were perfectly satisfied by this reply, for amidst the frequent and capricious vows by which knights were accustomed to bind themselves in the days of chivalry, there were none more common than those by which they engaged to remain incognito for a certain space, or until some particular adventure was achieved. The marshals, therefore, pressed no farther into the mystery of the Disinherited Knight, but, announcing to Prince John the conqueror's desire to remain unknown, they requested permission to bring him before his grace, in order that he might receive the reward of his valour. John's curiosity was excited by the mystery observed by the stranger, and being already displeased with the issue of the tournament, in which the challengers whom he favoured had been successively defeated by one knight, he answered haughtily to the marshals, "By the light of Our Lady's brow, this same knight hath been disinherited as well of his courtesy as of his lands, since he desires to appear before us without uncovering his face. Wot ye, my lords," he said, turning round to his train, "who this gallant can be that bears himself thus proudly?" "I cannot guess," answered De Bracy, "nor did I think that there had been within the four seas that girth Britain a champion that could bear down these 5 knights in one day's jousting. By my faith, I shall never forget the force with which he shocked De Vipont. The poor Hospitaller was hurled from his saddle like a stone from a sling." "Boast not of that," said a knight of St John who was present. "Your Temple champion had no better luck. I saw your brave lance, Bois Guilbert, roll thrice over, grasping his hands full of sand at every turn." De Bracy, being attached to the Templars, would have replied, but was prevented by Prince John. "Silence, sirs," he said. "What unprofitable debate have we here?" "The victor," said De Wyvil, "still waits the pleasure of your highness." "It is our pleasure," answered John, "that he do so wait until we learn whether there is not some one who can at least guess at his name and quality. Should he remain there till nightfall, he has had his work enough to keep him warm." "Your Grace," said Waldemar Fitzurse, "will do less than due honour to the victor, if you compel him to wait till we tell your highness that which we cannot know. At least I can form no guess, unless he be one of the good lances who accompanied King Richard to Palestine, and who are now straggling homeward from the Holy Land." "It may be the Earl of Salisbury," said De Bracy, "he is about the same pitch." "Sir Thomas de Multon, the Knight of Gisland, rather," said Fitzurse. "Salisbury is bigger in the bones." A whisper arose among the train, but by whom first suggested could not be ascertained. "It might be the King, it might be Richard Cœur-de-Lion himself." "Over God's forbode," said Prince John, involuntarily turning at the same time as pale as death, and shrinking as if blighted by a flash of lightning. Waldemar de Bracy! Brave knights and gentlemen, remember your promises, and stand truly by me." "Here is no danger impending," said Waldemar Fitzurse. "Are you so little acquainted with the gigantic limbs of your father's son, as to think they can be held within the circumference of yonder suit of armour? De Wyvil and Martival, you will best serve the Prince by bringing forward the victor to the throne, and ending an error that has conjured all the blood from his cheeks. Look at him more closely," he continued; "your Highness will see that he wants 3 inches of King Richard's height, and twice as much of his shoulder breadth. The very horse he backs could not have carried the ponderous weight of King Richard through a single course." While he was yet speaking, the marshals brought forward the Disinherited Knight to the foot of a wooden flight of steps, which formed the ascent from the lists to Prince John's throne. Still discomposed with the idea that his brother, so much injured, and to whom he was so much indebted, had suddenly arrived in his native kingdom, even the distinctions pointed out by Fitzurse did not altogether remove the Prince's apprehensions. And while, with a short and embarrassed eulogy upon his valour, he caused to be delivered to him the war horse assigned as the prize, he trembled lest from the barred visor of the mailed form before him an answer might be returned in the deep and awful accents of Richard the Lion-hearted. But the Disinherited Knight spoke not a word in reply to the compliment of the Prince, which he only acknowledged with a profound obeisance. The horse was led into the lists by 2 grooms richly dressed, the animal itself being fully accoutred with the richest war furniture, which, however, scarcely added to the value of the noble creature in the eyes of those who were judges. Laying one hand upon the pommel of the saddle, the Disinherited Knight vaulted at once upon the back of the steed without making use of the stirrup, and, brandishing aloft his lance, rode twice around the lists, exhibiting the points and paces of the horse with the skill of a perfect horseman. The appearance of vanity which might otherwise have been attributed to this display was removed by the propriety shown in exhibiting to the best advantage the princely reward with which he had been just honoured, and the knight was again greeted by the acclamations of all present. In the meanwhile, the bustling Prior of Jorvaulx had reminded Prince John, in a whisper, that the victor must now display his good judgment, instead of his valour, by selecting from among the beauties who graced the galleries a lady who should fill the throne of the Queen of Beauty and of Love, and deliver the prize of the tourney upon the ensuing day. The Prince accordingly made a sign with his truncheon as the knight passed him in his second career around the lists. The knight turned towards the throne, and, sinking his lance until the point was within a foot of the ground, remained motionless, as if expecting John's commands, while all admired the sudden dexterity with which he instantly reduced his fiery steed from a state of violent emotion and high excitation to the stillness of an equestrian statue. "Sir Disinherited Knight," said Prince John, "since that is the only title by which we can address you, it is now your duty, as well as privilege, to name the fair lady who, as Queen of Honour and of Love, is to preside over next day's festival. If, as a stranger in our land, you should require the aid of other judgment to guide your own, we can only say that Alicia, the daughter of our gallant knight Waldemar Fitzurse, has at our court been long held the first in beauty as in place. Nevertheless, it is your undoubted prerogative to confer on whom you please this crown, by the delivery of which to the lady of your choice the election of tomorrow's queen will be formal and complete. Raise your lance." The knight obeyed, and Prince John placed upon its point a coronet of green satin, having around its edge a circlet of gold, the upper edge of which was relieved by arrow points and hearts placed interchangeably, like the strawberry leaves and balls upon a ducal crown. In the broad hint which he dropped respecting the daughter of Waldemar Fitzurse, John had more than one motive, each the offspring of a mind which was a strange mixture of carelessness and presumption with low artifice and cunning. He wished to banish from the minds of the chivalry around him his own indecent and unacceptable jest respecting the Jewess Rebecca. He was desirous of conciliating Alicia's father, Waldemar, of whom he stood in awe, and who had more than once shown himself dissatisfied during the course of the day's proceedings. He had also a wish to establish himself in the good graces of the lady, for John was at least as licentious in his pleasures as profligate in his ambition. But besides all these reasons, he was desirous to raise up against the Disinherited Knight, towards whom he already entertained a strong dislike, a powerful enemy in the person of Waldemar Fitzurse, who was likely, he thought, highly to resent the injury done to his daughter in case, as was not unlikely, the victor should make another choice. And so indeed it proved, for the Disinherited Knight passed the gallery close to that of the Prince, in which the Lady Alicia was seated in the full pride of triumphant beauty, and pacing forwards as slowly as he had hitherto rode swiftly around the lists, he seemed to exercise his right of examining the numerous fair faces which adorned that splendid circle. It was worth while to see the different conduct of the beauties who underwent this examination, during the time it was proceeding. Some blushed, some assumed an air of pride and dignity, some looked straight forward and essayed to seem utterly unconscious of what was going on. Some drew back in alarm, which was perhaps affected. Some endeavoured to forbear smiling, and there were 2 or 3 who laughed outright. There were also some who dropped their veils over their charms, but as the Wardour manuscript says, these were fair ones of 10 years' standing. It may be supposed that, having had their full share of such vanities, they were willing to withdraw their claim, in order to give a fair chance to the rising beauties of the age. At length the champion paused beneath the balcony in which the Lady Rowena was placed, and the expectation of the spectators was excited to the utmost. It must be owned that, if an interest displayed in his success could have bribed the Disinherited Knight, the part of the lists before which he paused had merited his predilection. Cedric the Saxon, overjoyed at the discomfiture of the Templar, and still more so at the miscarriage of his 2 malevolent neighbours, Front de Bœuf and Malvoisin, had, with his body half stretched over the balcony, accompanied the victor in each course, not with his eyes only, but with his whole heart and soul. The Lady Rowena had watched the progress of the day with equal attention, though without openly betraying the same intense interest. Even the unmoved Athelstane had shown symptoms of shaking off his apathy, when calling for a huge goblet of muscadine, he quaffed it to the health of the Disinherited Knight. Another group, stationed under the gallery occupied by the Saxons, had shown no less interest in the fate of the day. "Father Abraham," said Isaac of York, when the first course was run betwixt the Templar and the Disinherited Knight, "how fiercely that gentile rides! Ah, the good horse that was brought all the long way from Barbary, he takes no more care of him than if he were a wild ass's colt. And the noble armour that was worth so many zecchins to Joseph Pareja, the armour of Milan, besides 70 in the 100 of profits, he cares for it as little as if he had found it in the highways." "If he risks his own person and limbs, father," said Rebecca, "in doing such a dreadful battle, he can scarce be expected to spare his horse and armour." "Child," replied Isaac, somewhat heated, "thou knowest not what thou speakest. His neck and limbs are his own, but his horse and armour belong to— Holy Jacob! What was I about to say? Nevertheless, it is a good youth. See, Rebecca, see, he is again about to go up to battle against the Philistine. Pray, child, pray for the safety of the good youth, and of the speedy horse and the rich armour. God of my fathers," he again exclaimed, "he hath conquered, and the uncircumcised Philistine hath fallen before his lance, even as Og the king of Bashan and Sihon king of the Amorites fell before the sword of our fathers. Surely he shall take their gold and their silver, and their war horses, and their armour of brass and of steel, for a prey and for a spoil." The same anxiety did the worthy Jew display during every course that was run, seldom failing to hazard a hasty calculation concerning the value of the horse and armour which were forfeited to the champion upon each new success. There had been therefore no small interest taken in the success of the Disinherited Knight by those who occupied the part of the lists before which he now paused. Whether from indecision or some other motive of hesitation, the champion of the day remained stationary for more than a minute, while the eyes of the silent audience were riveted upon his motions, and then, gradually and gracefully sinking the point of his lance, he deposited the coronet which it supported at the feet of the fair Rowena. The trumpets instantly sounded, while the heralds proclaimed the Lady Rowena the Queen of Beauty and of Love for the ensuing day, menacing with suitable penalties those who should be disobedient to her authority. Then they repeated their cry of largesse, to which Cedric, in the height of his joy, replied by an ample donative, and to which Athelstane, though less promptly, added one equally large. There was some murmuring among the damsels of Norman descent, who were as much unused to see the preference given to a Saxon beauty, as the Norman nobles were to sustain defeat in the games of chivalry which they themselves had introduced. But these sounds of disaffection were drowned by the popular shout of "Long live the Lady Rowena, the chosen and lawful Queen of Love and Beauty!" To which many in the lower area added, "Long live the Saxon Princess! Long live the race of the immortal Alfred!" However unacceptable these sounds might be to Prince John, and to those around him, he saw himself nevertheless obliged to confirm the nomination of the victor, and accordingly calling to horse, he left his throne and mounted his jennet. Accompanied by his train, he again entered the lists. The Prince paused a moment beneath the gallery of the Lady Alicia, to whom he paid his compliments, observing at the same time to those around him, "By my halidom, sirs, if the knight's feats in arms have shown that he hath limbs and sinews, his choice hath no less proved that his eyes are none of the clearest." It was on this occasion, as during his whole life, John's misfortune not perfectly to understand the characters of those whom he wished to conciliate. Waldemar Fitzurse was rather offended than pleased at the Prince stating thus broadly an opinion that his daughter had been slighted. "I know no right of chivalry," he said, "more precious or inalienable than that of each free knight to choose his lady love by his own judgment. My daughter courts distinction from no one, and in her own character, and in her own sphere, will never fail to receive the full proportion of that which is her due." Prince John replied not, but, spurring his horse as if to give vent to his vexation, he made the animal bound forward to the gallery where Rowena was seated, with the crown still at her feet. "Assume," he said, "fair lady, the mark of your sovereignty, to which none vows homage more sincerely than ourself, John of Anjou, and if it please you today, with your noble sire and friends, to grace our banquet in the castle of Ashby, we shall learn to know the Empress to whose service we devote tomorrow." Rowena remained silent, and Cedric answered for her in his native Saxon. "The Lady Rowena," he said, "possesses not the language in which to reply to your courtesy, or to sustain her part in your festival. I also, and the noble Athelstane of Coningsburgh, speak only the language and practice only the manners of our fathers. We therefore decline with thanks to your Highness's courteous invitation to the banquet. Tomorrow the Lady Rowena will take upon her the state to which she has been called by the free election of the victor knight, confirmed by the acclamations of the people." So saying, he lifted the coronet and placed it upon Rowena's head, in token of her acceptance of the temporary authority assigned to her. "What says he?" said Prince John, affecting not to understand the Saxon language, in which, however, he was well skilled. The purport of Cedric's speech was repeated to him in French. "It is well," he said. "Tomorrow we will ourself conduct this mute sovereign to her seat of dignity. You, at least, Sir Knight," he added, turning to the victor who had remained near the gallery, "will this day share our banquet?" The knight, speaking for the first time in a low and hurried voice, excused himself by pleading fatigue, and the necessity of preparing for tomorrow's encounter. "It is well," said Prince John haughtily. Although unused to such refusals, we will endeavour to digest our banquet as we may, though ungraced by the most successful in arms and his elected Queen of Beauty." So saying, he prepared to leave the lists with his glittering train, and his turning his steed for that purpose was the signal for the breaking up and dispersion of the spectators. Yet with the vindictive memory proper to offended pride, especially when combined with conscious want of desert, John had hardly proceeded 3 paces ere again, turning around, he fixed an eye of stern resentment upon the yeoman who had displeased him in the early part of the day, and issued his commands to the men-at-arms who stood near. "On your life, suffer not that fellow to escape." The yeoman stood the angry glance of the Prince with the same unvaried steadiness which had marked his former disportment, saying, with a smile, "I have no intention to leave Ashby until the day after tomorrow. I must see how Staffordshire and Leicestershire can draw their bows. The forests of Needwood and Charnwood must rear good archers." "Ay," said Prince John to his attendants, but not in direct reply, "I will see how he can draw his own, and woe betide him unless his skill should prove some apology for his insolence." "It is full time," said De Bracy, "that the outrequidance of these peasants should be restrained by some striking example." Waldemar Fitzurse, who probably, though his patron was not taking the readiest road to popularity, shrugged up his shoulders and was silent. Prince John resumed his retreat from the lists, and the dispersion of the multitude became general. In various routes, according to the different quarters from which they came, and in various groups of various numbers, the spectators were seen retiring over the plain. By far the most numerous part streamed towards the town of Ashby, where many of the distinguished persons were lodged in the castle, and where others found accommodation in the town itself. Among these were most of the knights, who had already appeared in the tournament, or who proposed to fight there the ensuing day, and who, as they rode slowly along, talking over the events of the day, were greeted with loud shouts by the populace. The same acclamations were bestowed upon Prince John, although he was indebted for them rather to the splendour of his appearance and train than the popularity of his character. A more sincere and more general, as well as a better merited acclamation, attended the victor of the day, until, anxious to withdraw himself from popular notice, he accepted the accommodation of one of those pavilions pitched at the extremities of the lists, the use of which was courteously tendered him by the marshals of the field. On his retiring to his tent, many who had lingered in the lists to look upon and form conjectures concerning him also dispersed. The signs and sounds of a tumultuous concourse of men, lately crowded together in one place, and agitated by the same passing events, were now exchanged for the distant hum of voices of different groups retreating in all directions, and these speedily died away in silence. No other sounds were heard, save the voices of the menials, who stripped the galleries of their cushions and tapestry, in order to put them in safety for the night, and wrangled among themselves for the half-used bottles of wine and relics of the refreshment which had been served round to the spectators. Beyond the precincts of the lists more than one forge was erected, and these now began to glimmer through the twilight, announcing the toil of the armourers, which was to continue through the whole night, in order to repair or alter the suits of armour to be used again on the morrow. A strong guard of men-at-arms, renewed at intervals from 2 hours to 2 hours, surrounded the lists and kept watch during the night. End of chapter 9. Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lemoyne, greenkri.com. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 10. Thus, like the sad presaging raven that tolls the sick man's passport in her hollow beak, and in the shadow of the silent night doth shake contagion from her sable wings. Vexed and tormented runs poor Barabas, with fatal curses towards these Christians. Jew of Malta. The Disinherited Knight had no sooner reached his pavilion than squires and pages in abundance tendered their services to disarm him, to bring fresh attire, and to offer him the refreshment of the bath. Their zeal on this occasion was perhaps sharpened by curiosity, since every one desired to know who the knight was that had gained so many laurels, yet had refused, even at the command of Prince John, to lift his visor or to name his name. But their officious inquisitiveness was not gratified. The Disinherited Knight refused all other assistance save that of his own squire, or rather yeoman, a clownish-looking man, who, wrapped in a cloak of dark-coloured felt, and having his head and face half buried in a Norman bonnet made of black fur, seemed to affect the incognito as much as his master. All others being excluded from the tent, this attendant relieved his master from the more burdensome parts of his armour, and placed food and wine before him, which the exertions of the day rendered very acceptable. The knight had scarcely finished a hasty meal, ere his menial announced to him that 5 men, each leading a barbed steed, desired to speak with him. The Disinherited Knight had exchanged his armour for the long robe usually worn by those of his condition, which, being furnished with a hood, concealed the features, when such was the pleasure of the wearer, almost as completely as the visor of the helmet itself. But the twilight, which was now fast darkening, would of itself have rendered a disguise unnecessary, unless to persons to whom the face of an individual chanced to be particularly well known. The Disinherited Knight, therefore, stepped boldly forth to the front of his tent, and found in attendance the squires of the challengers, whom he easily knew by their russet and black dresses, each of whom led his master's charger, loaded with the armour in which he had that day fought. "According to the laws of chivalry," said the foremost of these men, "I, Baldwin de Oily, squire to the redoubted knight Brian de Bois Guilbert, make offer to you, styling yourself for the present the Disinherited Knight, of the horse and armour used by the said Brian de Bois Guilbert in this day's passage of arms, leaving it with your nobleness to retain or to ransom the same, according to your pleasure, for such is the law of arms." The other squires repeated nearly the same formula, and then stood to await the decision of the Disinherited Knight. "To you four, sirs," replied the knight, addressing those who had last spoken, "and to your honourable and valiant masters, I have one common reply. Commend me to the noble knights, your masters, and say, I should do ill to deprive them of steeds and arms which can never be used by braver cavaliers. I would I could here end my message to these gallant knights, but being, as I term myself, in truth and earnest the Disinherited, I must be thus far bound to your masters, that they will, of their courtesy, be pleased to ransom their steeds and armour, since that which I wear I can hardly term mine own." "We stand commissioned, each of us," answered the squire of Reginald Front de Bœuf, "to offer 100 zecchins in ransom of these horses and suits of armour." "It is sufficient," said the Disinherited Knight. "Half the sum my present necessities compel me to accept. Of the remaining half, distribute 1 moiety among yourselves, sir squires, and divide the other half betwixt the heralds and the pursuivants, and minstrels and attendants." The squires, with cap in hand, and low reverences, expressed their deep sense of a courtesy and generosity not often practised, at least upon a scale so extensive. The Disinherited Knight then addressed his discourse to Baldwin, the squire of Brian de Bois Guilbert. "From your master," said he, "I will accept neither arms nor ransom. Say to him in my name, that our strife is not ended. No, not till we have fought as well with swords as with lances, as well on foot as on horseback. To this mortal quarrel he has himself defied me, and I shall not forget the challenge. Meantime, let him be assured that I hold him not as one of his companions, with whom I can with pleasure exchange courtesies, but rather as one with whom I stand upon terms of mortal defiance." "My master," answered Baldwin, "knows how to requite scorn with scorn, and blows with blows, as well as courtesy with courtesy. Since you disdain to accept from him any share of the ransom at which you have rated the arms of the other knights, I must leave his armour and his horse here, being well assured that he will never deign to mount the one, nor wear the other." "You have spoken well, good squire," said the Disinherited Knight, "well and boldly, as it beseemeth him to speak who answers for an absent master. Leave not, however, the horse and armour here. Restore them to thy master, or, if he scorns to accept them, retain them, good friend, for thine own use. So far as they are mine, I bestow them upon you freely." Baldwin made a deep obeisance, and retired with his companions, and the Disinherited Knight entered the pavilion. "Thus far, Gurth," said he, addressing his attendant, "the reputation of English chivalry hath not suffered in my hands." "And I," said Gurth, "for a Saxon swineherd, have not ill played the personage of a Norman squire-at-arms." "Yea, but," answered the Disinherited Knight, "thou hast ever kept me in anxiety lest thy clownish bearing should discover thee." "Tush," said Gurth, "I fear discovery from no one, saving my playfellow Wamba the Jester, of whom I could never discover whether he were most knave or fool. Yet I could scarce choose but laugh, when my old master passed so near to me, dreaming all the while that Gurth was keeping his porkers many a mile off, in the thickets and swamps of Rotherwood. If I am discovered—" "Enough," said the Disinherited Knight, "thou knowest my promise." "Nay, for that matter," said Gurth, "I will never fail my friend for fear of my skin cutting. I have a tough hide, that will bear knife or scourge as well as any boar's hide in my herd." "Trust me, I will requite the risk you run for my love, Gurth," said the knight. "Meanwhile, I pray you to accept these 10 pieces of gold." "I am richer," said Gurth, putting them into his pouch, "than ever was swineherd or bondsman." "Take this bag of gold to Ashby," continued his master, "and find out Isaac the Jew of York, and let him pay himself for the horse and arms with which his credit supplied me." "Nay, by St Dunstan," replied Gurth, "that I will not do." "How, knave!" replied his master, "wilt thou not obey my commands?" "So they be honest, reasonable, and Christian commands," replied Gurth; "but this is none of these. To suffer the Jew to pay himself would be dishonest, for it would be cheating my master, and unreasonable, for it were the part of a fool, and unchristian, since it would be plundering a believer to enrich an infidel." "See him contented, however, thou stubborn varlet," said the Disinherited Knight. "I will do so," said Gurth, taking the bag under his cloak, and leaving the apartment. "And it will go hard," he muttered, "but I content him with 1/2 of his own asking." So saying, he departed, and left the Disinherited Knight to his own perplexed ruminations, which, upon more accounts than it is now possible to communicate to the reader, were of a nature peculiarly agitating and painful. We must now change the scene to the village of Ashby, or rather to a country house in its vicinity, belonging to a wealthy Israelite, with whom Isaac, his daughter, and retinue had taken up their quarters. The Jews, it is well known, being as liberal in exercising the duties of hospitality and charity among their own people, as they were alleged to be reluctant and churlish in extending them to those whom they termed Gentiles, and whose treatment of them certainly merited little hospitality at their hand. In an apartment, small indeed, but richly furnished with decorations of an oriental taste, Rebecca was seated on a heap of embroidered cushions, which, piled along a low platform that surrounded the chamber, served like the estrada of the Spaniards, instead of chairs or stools. She was watching the motions of her father with a look of anxious and filial affection, while he paced the apartment with a dejected mien and disordered step, sometimes clasping his hands together, sometimes casting his eyes to the roof of the apartment, as one who laboured under great mental tribulation. "Oh, Jacob!" he exclaimed, "oh, all ye 12 holy fathers of our tribe, what a losing venture is this for one who hath duly kept every jot and tittle of the law of Moses! 50 zecchins wrenched from me at one clutch, and by the talons of a tyrant!" "But, father," said Rebecca, "you seemed to give the gold to Prince John willingly." "Willingly! The blotch of Egypt upon him! Willingly, saidst thou? Ay, as willingly as when, in the Gulf of Lions, I flung over my merchandise to lighten the ship, while she laboured in the tempest; robbed the seething billows in my choice silks, perfumed their briny foam with myrrh and aloes, enriched their caverns with gold and silver work. And was not that an hour of unutterable misery, though my own hands made the sacrifice?" "But it was a sacrifice which Heaven exacted to save our lives," answered Rebecca, "and the God of our fathers has since blessed your store with your gettings." "Ay," answered Isaac, "but if the tyrant lays hold on them as he did today, and compels me to smile while he is robbing me, oh, daughter, disinherited and wandering as we are, the worst evil which befalls our race is that when we are wronged and plundered, all the world laughs around, and we are compelled to suppress our sense of injury, and to smile tamely when we would revenge bravely." "Think not thus of it, my father," said Rebecca. "We also have advantages. These Gentiles, cruel and oppressive as they are in some sort dependent on the dispersed children of Zion, whom they despise and persecute. Without the aid of our wealth, they could neither furnish forth their hosts in war, nor their triumphs in peace. And the gold which we lend them returns with increase to our coffers. We are like the herb which flourisheth most when it is most trampled on. Even this day's pageant had not proceeded without the consent of the despised Jew who furnished the means." "Daughter," said Isaac, "thou hast harped upon another string of sorrow. The goodly steed and the rich armour, equal to the full profit of my adventure with our Kirjath Jairam of Leicester, there is a dead loss too, ay, a loss which swallows up the gains of a week, ay, of the space between 2 Sabbaths. And yet it may end better than I now think, for 'tis a good youth." "Assuredly," said Rebecca, "you shall not repent you of requiting the good deed received of the stranger knight." "I trust so, daughter," said Isaac, "and I trust too in the rebuilding of Zion. But as well do I hope with my own bodily eyes to see the walls and battlements of the new temple, as to see a Christian, yea, the very best of Christians, repay a debt to a Jew, unless under the awe of the judge and jailer." So saying, he resumed his discontented walk through the apartment, and Rebecca, perceiving that her attempts at consolation only served to awaken new subjects of complaint, wisely desisted from her unavailing efforts. A prudential line of conduct, and we recommend to all who set up for comforters and advisers to follow it in like circumstances. The evening was now becoming dark, when a Jewish servant entered the apartment, and placed upon the table 2 silver lamps fed with perfumed oil. The richest wines and the most delicate refreshments were at the same time displayed by another Israelitish domestic, on a small ebony table, inlaid with silver, for in the interior of their houses the Jews refused themselves no expensive indulgences. At the same time, the servant informed Isaac that a Nazarene, so they termed Christians while conversing among themselves, desired to speak with him. He that would live by traffic must hold himself at the disposal of every one claiming business with him. Isaac at once replaced on the table the untasted glass of Greek wine which he had just raised to his lips, and saying hastily to his daughter, "Rebecca, veil thyself. commanded the stranger to be admitted. Just as Rebecca had dropped over her fine features a screen of silver gauze which had reached to her feet, the door opened and Gurth entered, wrapped in the ample folds of his Norman mantle. His appearance was rather suspicious than prepossessing, especially as, instead of doffing his bonnet, he pulled it still deeper over his rugged brow. "Art thou Isaac, the Jew of York?" said Gurth in Saxon. "I am," replied Isaac, in the same language, for his traffic had rendered every tongue spoken in Britain familiar to him. "And who art thou?" "That is not for the purpose," answered Gurth. "As much as my name is to thee," replied Isaac, "for without knowing thine, how can I hold intercourse with thee?" "Easily," answered Gurth. "I, being to pay money, must know that I deliver it to the right person. Thou, who art to receive it, wilt not, I think, care very greatly by whose hands it is delivered." "Oh," said the Jew, "you are come to pay moneys? Holy Father Abraham, that altereth our relation to each other. And from whom dost thou bring it?" "From the Disinherited Knight," said Gurth, "victor in this day's tournament. It is the price of the armour supplied to him by Kirjath Jairam of Leicester, on thy recommendation. The steed is restored to thy stable. I desire to know the amount of the sum which I am to pay for the armour." "I said he was a good youth," exclaimed Isaac with joyful exultation. "A cup of wine will do thee no harm," he added, filling and handing to the swineherd a richer draught than Gurth had ever before tasted. "And how much money," continued Isaac, "hast thou brought with thee?" "Holy Virgin!" said Gurth, setting down the cup, "what nectar these unbelieving dogs drink, while true Christians are fain to quaff ale as muddy and thick as the draught we give to hogs! What money have I brought with me?" continued the Saxon, when he had finished this uncivil ejaculation. "Even but a small sum, something in hand the whilst. What, Isaac, thou must bear a conscience, though it be a Jewish one." "Nay, but," said Isaac, "thy master has won goodly steeds and rich armours with the strength of his lance and of his right hand. But 'tis a good youth. The Jew will take these in present payment, and render him back the surplus." "My master has disposed of them already," said Gurth. "Ah, that was wrong," said the Jew. "That was the part of a fool. No Christian here could buy so many horses and armour. No Jew except myself would give him half the values. But thou hast 100 zecchins with thee in that bag," said Isaac, prying under Gurth's cloak. "It is a heavy one." "I have heads for crossbow bolts in it," said Gurth readily. "Well then," said Isaac, panting and hesitating between habitual love of gain and a new-born desire to be liberal in the present instance, "if I should say that I would take 80 zecchins for the good steed and the rich armour, which leaves me not a guilder's profit, have you money to pay me?" "Barely," said Gurth, though the sum demanded was more reasonable than he expected. "And it will leave my master nigh penniless. Nevertheless, if such be your least offer, I must be content." "Fill thyself another goblet of wine," said the Jew. "Ah, 80 zecchins is too little. It leaveth no profit for the usages of the moneys. And besides, the good horse may have suffered wrong in this day's encounter. Oh, it was a hard and a dangerous meeting, man and steed rushing on each other like wild bulls of Bashan. The horse cannot but have had wrong." "And I say," replied Gurth, "he is sound, wind and limb, and you may see him now in your stable. And I say, over and above, that 70 zecchins is enough for the armour, and I hope a Christian's word is as good as a Jew's. If you will not take 70, I will carry this bag," and he shook it till the contents jingled, "back to my master." "Nay, nay," said Isaac, "lay down the talents, the shekels, the 80 zecchins, and thou shalt see I will consider thee liberally." Gurth at length complied, and telling out 80 zecchins upon the table, the Jew delivered out to him an acquittance for the horse and suit of armour. The Jew's hand trembled for joy as he wrapped up the first 70 pieces of gold. The last 10 he told over with much deliberation, pausing, and saying something as he took each piece from the table and dropped it into his purse. It seemed as if his avarice were struggling with his better nature, and compelling him to pouch zecchin after zecchin, while his generosity urged him to restore some part, at least, to his benefactor, or as a donation to his agent. His whole speech ran nearly thus: 71, 72, thy master is a good youth, 73, an excellent youth, 74, that piece hath been clipped within the ring, 75, and that looketh light of weight, 76, when thy master wants money, let him come to Isaac of York, 77, that is with reasonable security. Here he made a considerable pause, and Gurth had hope that the last 3 pieces might escape the fate of their comrades, but the enumeration proceeded: 78, thou art a good fellow, 79, and deservest something for thyself. Here the Jew paused again, and looked at the last zecchin, intending doubtless to bestow it upon Gurth. He weighed it upon the tip of his finger, and made it ring by dropping it upon the table. Had it rung too flat, or had it felt a hair's breadth too light, generosity had carried the day. But, unhappily for Gurth, the chime was full and true, the zecchin plump, newly coined, and a grain above weight. Isaac could not find it in his heart to part with it, so dropped it into his purse, as if in absence of mind, with the words, 80 completes the tale, and I trust thy master will reward thee handsomely. Surely," he added, looking earnestly at the bag, "thou hast more coins in that pouch." Gurth grinned, which was his nearest approach to a laugh, as he replied, "About the same quantity which thou hast told over so carefully." He then folded the quittance, and put it under his cap, adding, "Peril of thy beard, Jew, see that this be full and ample." He filled himself, unbidden, a 3rd goblet of wine, and left the apartment without ceremony. "Rebecca," said the Jew, "that Ishmaelite hath gone somewhat beyond me. Nevertheless, his master is a good youth. Ay, and I am well pleased that he hath gained shekels of gold and shekels of silver, even by the speed of his horse, and by the strength of his lance, which, like that of Goliath the Philistine, might vie with the weaver's beam." As he turned to receive Rebecca's answer, he observed that during his chaffering with Gurth, she had left the apartment unperceived. In the meanwhile, Gurth had descended the stair, and having reached the dark antechamber, or hall, was puzzling about to discover the entrance, when a figure in white, shown by a small silver lamp, which she held in her hand, beckoned him to a side apartment. Gurth had some reluctance to obey the summons. Rough and impetuous as a wild boar, where only earthly force was to be apprehended, he had all the characteristic terrors of a Saxon respecting fawns, forest fiends, white women, and the whole of the superstitions which his ancestors had brought with them from the wilds of Germany. He remembered, moreover, that he was in the house of a Jew, a people who, besides the other amiable qualities which popular report ascribed to them, were supposed to be profound necromancers and Kabbalists. Nevertheless, after a moment's pause, he obeyed the beckoning summons of the apparition, and followed her into the apartment which she indicated, where he found, to his joyful surprise, that his fair guide was the beautiful Jewess whom he had seen at the tournament, and a short time in her father's apartment. She asked him the particulars of his transaction with Isaac, which he detailed accurately. "My father did but jest with thee, good fellow," said Rebecca. "He owes thy master deeper kindness than these arms and steed could pay, were their value tenfold. What sum didst thou pay my father even now?" 80 zecchins, said Gurth, surprised at the question. "In this purse," said Rebecca, "thou wilt find 100. Restore to thy master that which is his due, and enrich thyself with the remainder. Haste, begone, stay not to render thanks, and beware how you pass through this crowded town, where thou mayst easily lose both thy burden and thy life. Reuben," she added, clapping her hands together, "light forth this stranger, and fail not to draw lock and bar behind him." Reuben, a dark-browed and black-bearded Israelite, obeyed her summons with a torch in his hand, undid the outward door of the house, and conducting Gurth across a paved court, let him out through a wicket in the entrance gate, which he closed behind him with such bolts and chains as would well have become that of a prison. "By St Dunstan," said Gurth, as he stumbled up the dark avenue, "this is no Jewess, but an angel from heaven. 10 zecchins from my brave young master, 20 from this pearl of Zion. Oh, happy day! Such another, Gurth, will redeem thy bondage, and make thee a brother, as free of thy guild as the best. And then do I lay down my swineherd's horn and staff, and take the freeman's sword and buckler, and follow my young master to the death, without hiding either my face or my name." End of chapter 10. Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lemoyne. greenkri.com. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 11. First Outlaw. "Stand, sir, and throw us that you have about you. If not, we'll make you sit and rifle you." Speed. "Sir, we are undone. These are the villains that all the travellers do fear so much." Val. "My friends." First Out. "That's not so, sir. We are your enemies." Second Out. "Peace, we'll hear him." Third Out. "Ay, by my beard will we, for he's a proper man." Two Gentlemen of Verona. The nocturnal adventures of Gurth were not yet concluded. Indeed, he himself became partly of that mind when, after passing one or two straggling houses which stood in the outskirts of the village, he found himself in a deep lane, running between two banks overgrown with hazel and holly, while here and there a dwarf oak flung its arms all together across the path. The lane was, moreover, much rutted and broken up by the carriages which had recently transported articles of various kinds to the tournament, and it was dark, for the banks and bushes intercepted the light of the harvest moon. From the village were heard the distant sounds of revelry, mixed occasionally with loud laughter, sometimes broken by screams, and sometimes by wild strains of distant music. All these sounds, intimating the disorderly state of the town, crowded with military nobles and their dissolute attendants, gave Gurth some uneasiness. "The Jewess was right," he said to himself. "By heaven and St Dunstan, I would I were safe at my journey's end with all this treasure. Here are such numbers, I will not say errant of thieves, but of errant knights and errant squires, errant monks and errant minstrels, errant jugglers and errant jesters, that a man with a single merk would be in danger, much more a poor swineherd with a whole bagful of zecchins. Would I were out of the shade of these infernal bushes, that I might at least see any of St Nicholas's clerks before they spring on my shoulders." Gurth accordingly hastened his pace, in order to gain the open common to which the lane led, but was not so fortunate as to accomplish his object. Just as he attained the upper end of the lane, where the underwood was thickest, 4 men sprung upon him, even as his fears anticipated, 2 from each side of the road, and seized him so fast, that resistance, if at first practicable, would have been now too late. "Surrender your charge," said one of them. "We are the deliverers of the Commonwealth, who ease every man of his burden." "You should not ease me of mine so lightly," muttered Gurth, whose surly honesty could not be tamed even by the pressure of immediate violence. "Had I it but in my power to give 3 strokes in its defence." "We shall see that presently," said the robber; and, speaking to his companions, he added, "Bring along the knave. I see he would have his head broken, as well as his purse cut, and so be let blood in 2 veins at once." Gurth was hurried along agreeably to this mandate, and having been dragged somewhat roughly over the bank on the left-hand side of the lane, found himself in a straggling thicket, which lay betwixt it and the open common. He was compelled to follow his rough conductors into the very depth of this cover, where they stopped unexpectedly in an irregular open space, free in a great measure from trees, and on which, therefore, the beams of the moon fell without much interruption from boughs and leaves. Here his captors were joined by two other persons, apparently belonging to the gang. They had short swords by their sides, and quarter-staves in their hands, and Gurth could now observe that all six wore visors, which rendered their occupation a matter of no question, even had their former proceedings left it in doubt. "What money hast thou, churl?" said one of the thieves. 30 zecchins of my own property," answered Gurth doggedly. "A forfeit, a forfeit," shouted the robbers. "A Saxon hath 30 zecchins, and returned sober from a village? An undeniable and unredeemable forfeit of all he hath about him." "I hoarded it to purchase my freedom," said Gurth. "Thou art an ass," replied one of the thieves. 3 quarts of a double ale had rendered thee as free as thy master, ay, and freer too, if he be a Saxon like thyself." "A sad truth," replied Gurth; "but if these same 30 zecchins will buy my freedom from you, unloose my hands, and I will pay them to you." "Hold," said one who seemed to exercise some authority over the others. "This bag which thou bearest, as I can feel through thy cloak, contains more coin than thou hast told us of." "It is the good knight my master's," answered Gurth, "of which assuredly I would not have spoken a word, had you been satisfied with working your will upon mine own property." "Thou art an honest fellow," replied the robber, "I warrant thee, and we worship not Saint Nicholas so devoutly, but what thy 30 zecchins may yet escape if thou deal uprightly with us. Meantime, render up thy trust for the time." So saying, he took from Gurth's breast the large leathern pouch, in which the purse given him by Rebecca was enclosed, as well as the rest of the zecchins, and then continued his interrogation. "Who is thy master?" "The Disinherited Knight," said Gurth. "Whose good lance," replied the robber, "won the prize in today's tourney? What is his name and lineage?" "It is his pleasure," answered Gurth, "that they be concealed, and from me assuredly you will learn naught of them." "What is thine own name and lineage?" "To tell that," said Gurth, "might reveal my master's." "Thou art a saucy groom," said the robber; "but of that anon. How comes thy master by this gold? Is it of his inheritance, or by what means hath it accrued to him?" "By his good lance," answered Gurth. "These bags contain the ransom of 4 good horses and 4 good suits of armour." "How much is there?" demanded the robber. 200 zecchins. "Only 200 zecchins," said the bandit. "Your master hath dealt liberally by the vanquished, and put them to a cheap ransom. Name those who paid the gold." Gurth did so. "The armour and horse of the Templar Brian de Bois Guilbert. At what ransom were they held? Thou seest thou canst not deceive me." "My master," replied Gurth, "will take naught from the Templar save his life's blood. They are on terms of mortal defiance, and cannot hold courteous intercourse together." "Indeed!" repeated the robber, and paused after he had said the word. "And what wert thou now doing at Ashby with such a charge in thy custody?" "I went thither to render to Isaac the Jew of York," replied Gurth, "the price of a suit of armour with which he fitted my master for this tournament." "And how much didst thou pay to Isaac? Methinks, to judge by weight, there is still 200 zecchins in this pouch." "I paid to Isaac," said the Saxon, 80 zecchins, and he restored me 100 in lieu thereof." "How? What?" exclaimed all the robbers at once. "Darest thou trifle with us, that thou tellest such improbable lies?" "What I tell you," said Gurth, is as true as the moon is in heaven. You will find the just sum in a silken purse within the leathern pouch, and separated from the rest of the gold." "Bethink thee, man," said the Captain, "thou speakest of a Jew, of an Israelite, as unapt to restore gold as the dry sand of his desert to return the cup of water which the pilgrim spills upon them." "There is no more mercy in them," said another of the banditti, "than in an unbribed sheriff's officer." "It is, however, as I say," said Gurth. "Strike a light instantly," said the Captain. "I will examine this said purse, and if it be as this fellow says, the Jew's bounty is little less miraculous than the stream which relieved his fathers in the wilderness." A light was procured accordingly, and the robber proceeded to examine the purse. The others crowded around him, and even two who had hold of Gurth relaxed their grasp, while they stretched their neck to see the issue of the search. Availing himself of their negligence, by a sudden exertion of strength and activity, Gurth shook himself free of their hold, and might have escaped, could he have resolved to leave his master's property behind him. But such was no part of his intention. He wrenched a quarterstaff from one of the fellows, struck down the Captain, who was altogether unaware of his purpose, and had well nigh repossessed himself of the pouch and treasure. The thieves, however, were too nimble for him, and again secured both the bag and the trusty Gurth. "Knave," said the Captain, getting up, "thou hast broken my head, and with other men of our sort thou wouldst fare the worse for thy insolence. But thou shalt know thy fate instantly. First, let us speak of thy master. The knight's matters must go before the squire's, according to the due order of chivalry. Stand thou fast in the meantime. If thou stir again, thou shalt have that will make thee quiet for thy life. Comrades," he then said, addressing his gang, "this purse is embroidered with Hebrew characters, and I well believe the yeoman's tale is true. The errant knight, his master, must needs pass us toll-free. He is too like ourselves for us to make booty of him, since dogs should not worry dogs where wolves and foxes are to be found in abundance." "Like us?" answered one of the gang. "I should like to hear how that is made good." "Why, thou fool," answered the Captain, "is he not poor and disinherited as we are? Doth he not win his substance at the sword's point as we do? Hath he not beaten Front de Bœuf and Malvoisin even as we would beat them if we could? Is he not the enemy to life and death of Brian de Bois Guilbert, whom we have so much reason to fear? And were all this otherwise, wouldst thou have us show a worse conscience than an unbeliever, a Hebrew Jew?" "Nay, that were a shame," muttered the other fellow. "And yet, when I served in the band of stout old Gandelin, we had no such scruples of conscience. And this insolent peasant, he too, I warrant me, is to be dismissed scatheless?" "Not if thou canst scathe him," replied the Captain. "Here, fellow," continued he, addressing Gurth, "canst thou use the staff, thou that start'st to it so readily?" "I think," said Gurth, "thou shouldst be best able to reply to that question." "Nay, by my troth, thou gavest me a round knock," replied the Captain. "Do as much for this fellow, and thou shalt pass scot-free; and if thou dost not, why, by my faith, as thou art such a sturdy knave, I think I must pay thy ransom myself. Take thy staff, miller," he added, "and keep thy head. And do you others let the fellow go, and give him a staff. There is little enough to lay on load by." The two champions, being alike armed with quarter-staves, stepped forward into the centre of the open space, in order to have the full benefit of the moonlight. The thieves in the meantime laughing and crying to their comrade, "Miller, beware thy toll-dish." The miller, on the other hand, holding his quarter-staff by the middle, and making it flourish round his head after the fashion which the French call faire le moulinet, exclaimed boastfully, "Come on, churl, an thou darest, thou shalt feel the strength of a miller's thumb." "If thou be'st a miller," answered Gurth undauntedly, making his weapon play around his head with equal dexterity, "thou art doubly a thief, and I, as a true man, bid thee defiance." So saying, the two champions closed together, and for a few minutes they displayed great equality in strength, courage, and skill, intercepting and returning the blows of their adversary with the most rapid dexterity, while, from the continued clatter of their weapons, a person at a distance might have supposed that there were at least 6 persons engaged on each side. Less obstinate, and even less dangerous combats have been described in good heroic verse. But that of Gurth and the Miller must remain unsung, for want of a sacred poet to do justice to its eventful progress. Yet, though quarter-staff play be out of date, what we can in prose we will do for these bold champions. Long they fought equally, until the Miller began to lose temper at finding himself so stoutly opposed, and at hearing the laughter of his companions, who, as usual in such cases, enjoyed his vexation. This was not a state of mind favourable to the noble game of quarter-staff, in which, as in ordinary cudgel-playing, the utmost coolness is requisite, and it gave Gurth, whose temper was steady, though surly, the opportunity of acquiring a decided advantage, in availing himself of which he displayed great mastery. The Miller pressed furiously forward, dealing blows with either end of his weapon alternately, and striving to come to half-staff distance, while Gurth defended himself against the attack, keeping his hands about a yard asunder, and covering himself by shifting his weapon with great celerity, so as to protect his head and body. Thus did he maintain the defensive, making his eye, foot, and hand keep true time, until, observing his antagonist to lose wind, he darted the staff at his face with his left hand, and as the Miller endeavoured to parry the thrust, he slid his right hand down to his left, and with the full swing of the weapon struck his opponent on the left side of the head, who instantly measured his length upon the green sward. "Well and yeomanly done!" shouted the robbers. "Fair play, and Old England for ever! The Saxon has saved both his purse and his hide, and the Miller has met his match. Thou mayst go thy ways, my friend," said the captain, addressing Gurth, in special confirmation of the general voice, "and I will cause 2 of my comrades to guide thee by the best way to thy master's pavilion, and to guard thee from night-walkers that might have less tender consciences than ours. For there is many one of them upon the amble in such a night as this. Take heed, however," he added sternly. "Remember thou hast refused to tell thy name. Ask not after ours, nor endeavour to discover who or what we are, for if thou makest such an attempt, thou wilt come by worse fortune than has yet befallen thee." Gurth thanked the captain for his courtesy, and promised to attend to his recommendation. 2 of the outlaws, taking up their quarter-staves, and desiring Gurth to follow close in the rear, walked roundly forward along a by-path, which traversed the thicket and the broken ground adjacent to it. On the very verge of the thicket, 2 men spoke to his conductors, and receiving an answer in a whisper, withdrew into the wood, and suffered them to pass unmolested. This circumstance induced Gurth to believe both that the gang was strong in numbers, and that they kept regular guards around their place of rendezvous. When they arrived on the open heath, where Gurth might have had some trouble in finding his road, the thieves guided him straight forward to the top of a little eminence, whence he could see, spread beneath him in the moonlight, the palisades of the lists, the glimmering pavilions pitched at either end, with the pennons which adorned them fluttering in the moonbeam, and from which could be heard the hum of the song with which the sentinels were beguiling their night watch. Here the thieves stopped. "We go with you no farther," said they. "It were not safe that we should do so. Remember the warning you have received. Keep secret what has this night befallen you, and you will have no room to repent it. Neglect what is now told you, and the Tower of London shall not protect you against our revenge." "Good night to you, kind sirs," said Gurth. "I shall remember your orders, and trust that there is no offence in wishing you a safer and an honester trade." Thus they parted, the outlaws returning in the direction from whence they had come, and Gurth proceeding to the tent of his master, to whom, notwithstanding the injunction he had received, he communicated the whole adventures of the evening. The Disinherited Knight was filled with astonishment, no less at the generosity of Rebecca, by which, however, he resolved he would not profit, than that of the robbers, to whose profession such a quality seemed totally foreign. His course of reflections upon these singular circumstances was, however, interrupted by the necessity for taking repose, which the fatigue of the preceding day, and the propriety of refreshing himself for the morrow's encounter, rendered alike indispensable. The knight, therefore, stretched himself for repose upon a rich couch with which the tent was provided, and the faithful Gurth, extending his hardy limbs upon a bear skin, which formed a sort of carpet to the pavilion, laid himself across the opening of the tent, so that no one could enter without awakening him. Chapter 11. Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain, and for more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lemoyne, greenkri.com. Ivanhoe, by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 12. The heralds left their pricking up and down, now ring in trumpets loud and clarion. There is no more to say, but east and west. In go the spears sadly, in the rest. In goeth the sharp spur into the side. There see men who can just and who can ride. There shiver shafts upon shields thick. He feeleth through the heart's bone the prick. Up springen spears 20 feet in height. Out go the swords to the silver bright. The helms they to hewn and shred. Out burst the blood with stern streams red. Chaucer. Morning arose in unclouded splendour, and ere the sun was much above the horizon, the idlest, or the most eager of the spectators appeared on the common, moving to the lists as to a general centre, in order to secure a favourable situation for viewing the continuation of the expected games. The marshals and their attendants appeared next on the field, together with the heralds, for the purpose of receiving the names of the knights who intended to joust, with the side which each chose to espouse. This was a necessary precaution, in order to secure equality betwixt the two bodies who should be opposed to each other. According to due formality, the disinherited knight was to be considered as leader of the one body, while Brian de Bois Guilbert, who had been rated as having done second best in the preceding day, was named first champion of the other band. Those who had concurred in the challenge adhered to his party, of course, excepting only Ralph de Vipont, whom his fall had rendered unfit so soon to put on his armour. There was no want of distinguished and noble candidates to fill up the ranks on either side. In fact, although the general tournament, in which all knights fought at once, was more dangerous than single encounters, they were nevertheless more frequented and practised by the chivalry of the age. Many knights, who had not sufficient confidence in their own skill to defy a single adversary of high reputation, were nevertheless desirous of displaying their valour in the general combat, where they might meet others with whom they were more upon equality. On the present occasion, about 50 knights were inscribed as desirous of combating upon each side, when the marshals declared that no more could be admitted, to the disappointment of several who were too late in preferring their claim to be included. About the hour of 10 o'clock, the whole plain was crowded with horsemen, horsewomen, and foot-passengers, hastening to the tournament, and shortly after a grand flourish of trumpets announced Prince John and his retinue, attended by many of those knights who meant to take share in the game, as well as others who had no such intention. About the same time arrived Cedric the Saxon, with the Lady Rowena, unattended, however, by Athelstane. This Saxon lord had arrayed his tall and strong person in armour, in order to take his place among the combatants, and considerably to the surprise of Cedric, had chosen to enlist himself on the part of the Knight Templar. The Saxon, indeed, had remonstrated strongly with his friend upon the injudicious choice he had made of his party, but he had only received that sort of answer usually given by those who are more obstinate in following their own course than strong in justifying it. His best, if not his only, reason for adhering to the party of Brian de Bois Guilbert, Athelstane had the prudence to keep to himself. Though his apathy of disposition prevented his taking any means to recommend himself to the Lady Rowena, he was nevertheless by no means insensible to her charms, and considered his union with her as a matter already fixed beyond doubt by the assent of Cedric and her other friends. It had therefore been with smothered displeasure that the proud, though indolent Lord of Coningsburgh beheld the victor of the preceding day select Rowena as the object of that honour which it became his privilege to confer, in order to punish him for a preference which seemed to interfere with his own suit. Athelstane, confident of his strength, and to whom his flatterers, at least, ascribed great skill in arms, had determined not only to deprive the disinherited knight of his powerful succour, but, if an opportunity should occur, to make him feel the weight of his battle-axe. De Bracy and other knights attached to Prince John, in obedience to a hint from him, had joined the party of the challengers, John being desirous to secure, if possible, the victory to that side. On the other hand, many other knights, both English and Norman, natives and strangers, took part against the challengers, the more readily that the opposite band was to be led by so distinguished a champion as the disinherited knight had proved himself. As soon as Prince John observed that the destined queen of the day had arrived upon the field, assuming that air of courtesy which sat well upon him when he was pleased to exhibit it, he rode forward to meet her, doffed his bonnet, and alighting from his horse, assisted the Lady Rowena from her saddle, while his followers uncovered at the same time, and one of the most distinguished dismounted to hold her palfrey. "It is thus," said Prince John, "that we set the dutiful example of loyalty to the Queen of Love and Beauty, and are ourselves her guide to the throne which she must this day occupy. Ladies," he said, "attend your queen, as you wish in your turn to be distinguished by like honours." So saying, the Prince marshalled Rowena to the seat of honour opposite his own, while the fairest and most distinguished ladies present crowded after her to obtain places as near as possible to their temporary sovereign. No sooner was Rowena seated than a burst of music, half drowned by the shouts of the multitude, greeted her new dignity. Meantime, the sun shone fierce and bright upon the polished arms of the knights of either side, who crowded the opposite extremities of the lists, and held eager conference together concerning the best mode of arranging their line of battle, and supporting the conflict. The heralds then proclaimed silence, until the laws of the tourney should be rehearsed. These were calculated in some degree to abate the dangers of the day, a precaution the more necessary as the conflict was to be maintained with sharp swords and pointed lances. The champions were therefore prohibited to thrust with the sword, and were confined to striking. A knight, it was announced, might use a mace or a battle-axe at pleasure, but the dagger was a prohibited weapon. A knight unhorsed might renew the fight on foot with any other on the opposite side in the same predicament, but mounted horsemen were in that case forbidden to assail him. When any knight could force his antagonist to the extremity of the lists, so as to touch the palisade with his person or arms, such opponent was obliged to yield himself vanquished, and his armour and horse were placed at the disposal of the conqueror. A knight thus overcome was not permitted to take further share in the combat. If any combatant was struck down, and unable to recover his feet, his squire or page might enter the lists and drag his master out of the press, but in that case the knight was adjudged vanquished, and his arms and horse declared forfeited. The combat was to cease as soon as Prince John should throw down his leading staff, or truncheon, another precaution usually taken to prevent the unnecessary effusion of blood by the too long endurance of a sport so desperate. Any knight breaking the rules of the tournament, or otherwise transgressing the rules of honourable chivalry, was liable to be stripped of his arms, and, having his shield reversed, to be placed in that posture astride upon the bars of the palisade, and exposed to public derision, in punishment of his unknightly conduct. Having announced these precautions, the heralds concluded with an exhortation to each good knight to do his duty, and to merit favour from the Queen of Beauty and Love. This proclamation having been made, the heralds withdrew to their stations. The knights, entering at either end of the lists in long procession, arranged themselves in a double file, precisely opposite to each other, the leader of each party being in the centre of the foremost rank, a post which he did not occupy until each had carefully arranged the ranks of his party, and stationed every one in his place. It was a goodly, and at the same time an anxious sight to behold so many gallant champions, mounted bravely and armed richly, stand ready prepared for an encounter so formidable, seated on their war saddles like so many pillars of iron, and awaiting the signal of encounter with the same ardour as their generous steeds, which, by neighing and pawing the ground, gave signal of their impatience. As yet the knights held their long lances upright, their bright points glancing to the sun, and the streamers with which they were decorated fluttering over the plumage of the helmets. Thus they remained, while the marshals of the field surveyed their ranks with the utmost exactness, lest either party had more or fewer than the appointed number. The tale was found exactly complete. The marshals then withdrew from the lists, and William de Wyvil, with a voice of thunder, pronounced the signal words. "Laissez aller!" The trumpet sounded as he spoke. The spears of the champions were at once lowered and placed in the rests. The spurs were dashed into the flanks of the horses, and the two foremost ranks of either party rushed upon each other in full gallop, and met in the middle of the lists with a shock the sound of which was heard at a mile's distance. The rear rank of each party advanced at a slower pace, to sustain the defeated and follow up the success of the victors of their party. The consequences of the encounter were not instantly seen, for the dust raised by the trampling of so many steeds darkened the air, and it was a minute ere the anxious spectators could see the fate of the encounter. When the fight became visible, half the knights on each side were dismounted, some by the dexterity of their adversary's lance, some by the superior weight and strength of opponents, which had borne down both horse and man. Some lay stretched on the earth, as if never more to arise. Some had already gained their feet, and were closing hand to hand with those of their antagonists who were in the same predicament. And several on both sides, who had received wounds by which they were disabled, were stopping their blood by their scarfs, and endeavouring to extricate themselves from the tumult. The mounted knights, whose lances had been almost all broken by the fury of the encounter, were now closely engaged with their swords, shouting their war cries and exchanging buffets, as if honour and life depended on the issue of the combat. The tumult was presently increased by the advance of the second rank on either side, which, acting as a reserve, now rushed on to aid their companions. The followers of Brian de Bois Guilbert shouted, "Ha! Beaucin! Beaucin! For the Temple! For the Temple!" The opposite party shouted in answer, "Desdicado! Desdicado!" which watchword they took from the motto upon their leader's shield. The champions thus encountering each other with the utmost fury, and with alternate success, the tide of battle seemed to flow now toward the southern, now toward the northern extremity of the lists, as the one or the other party prevailed. Meantime the clang of the blows and the shouts of the combatants mixed fearfully with the sound of the trumpets, and drowned the groans of those who fell, and lay rolling defenceless beneath the feet of the horses. The splendid armour of the combatants was now defaced with dust and blood, and gave way at every stroke of the sword and battle-axe. The gay plumage shorn from the crests drifted upon the breeze like snowflakes. All that was beautiful and graceful in the martial array had disappeared, and what was now visible was only calculated to awake terror or compassion. Yet such is the force of habit, that not only the vulgar spectators, who are naturally attracted by sights of horror, but even the ladies of distinction who crowded the galleries, saw the conflict with a thrilling interest, certainly, but without a wish to withdraw their eyes from a sight so terrible. Here and there, indeed, a fair cheek might turn pale, or a faint scream might be heard, as a lover, a brother, or a husband was struck from his horse. But in general, the ladies around encouraged the combatants, not only by clapping their hands and waving their veils and kerchiefs, but even by exclaiming, "Brave lance! Good sword!" when any successful thrust or blow took place under their observation. Such being the interest taken by the fair sex in this bloody game, that of the men is the more easily understood. It showed itself in loud acclamations upon every change of fortune, while all eyes were so riveted on the lists that the spectators seemed as if they themselves had dealt and received the blows which were there so freely bestowed, and between every pause was heard the voice of the heralds exclaiming, "Fight on, brave knights! Man dies, but glory lives! Fight on! Death is better than defeat! Fight on, brave knights, for bright eyes behold your deeds!" Amid the varied fortunes of the combat, the eyes of all endeavoured to discover the leaders of each band, who, mingling in the thick of the fight, encouraged their companions both by voice and example. Both displayed great feats of gallantry, nor did either Bois Guilbert or the Disinherited Knight find in the ranks opposed to them a champion who could be termed their unquestioned match. They repeatedly endeavoured to single out each other, spurred by mutual animosity, and aware that the fall of the leader might be considered as decisive of victory. Such, however, was the crowd and confusion, that during the earlier part of the conflict their efforts to meet were unavailing, and they were repeatedly separated by the eagerness of their followers, each of whom was anxious to win honour by measuring his strength against the leader of the opposite party. But when the field became thin by the numbers on either side, who had yielded themselves vanquished, had been compelled to the extremity of the lists, or been otherwise rendered incapable of continuing the strife, the Templar and the Disinherited Knight at length encountered hand to hand, with all the fury that mortal animosity, joined to rivalry of honour, could inspire. Such was the address of each in parrying and striking, that the spectators broke forth into a unanimous and involuntary shout, expressive of their delight and admiration. But at this moment the party of the Disinherited Knight had the worst. The gigantic arm of Front de Bœuf on the one flank, and the ponderous strength of Athelstane on the other, bearing down and dispersing those immediately exposed to them. Finding themselves freed from their immediate antagonists, it seems to have occurred to both these knights at the same instant, that they would render the most decisive advantage to their party by aiding the Templar in his contest with his rival. Turning their horses, therefore, at the same moment, the Norman spurred against the Disinherited Knight on the one side, and the Saxon on the other. It was utterly impossible that the object of this unequal and unexpected assault could have sustained it, had he not been warned by a general cry from the spectators, who could not but take interest in one exposed to such disadvantage. "Beware, beware, Sir Disinherited!" was shouted so universally, that the knight became aware of his danger, and striking a full blow at the Templar, he reined back his steed in the same moment, so as to escape the charge of Athelstane and Front de Bœuf. These knights, therefore, Their aim being thus eluded, rushed from opposite sides betwixt the object of their attack and the Templar, almost running their horses against each other ere they could stop their career. Recovering their horses, however, and wheeling them around, the whole three pursued their united purpose of bearing to the earth the Disinherited Knight. Nothing could have saved him, except the remarkable strength and activity of the noble horse which he had won on the preceding day. This stood him in the more stead, as the horse of Bois Guilbert was wounded, and those of Front de Bœuf and Athelstane were both tired with the weight of their gigantic masters, clad in complete armour, and with the preceding exertions of the day. The masterly horsemanship of the Disinherited Knight, and the activity of the noble animal which he mounted, enabled him, for a few minutes, to keep at sword's point his three antagonists, turning and wheeling with the agility of a hawk upon the wing, keeping his enemies as far separate as he could, and rushing now against the one, now against the other, dealing sweeping blows with his sword, without waiting to receive those which were aimed at him in return. But although the lists rang with the applauses of his dexterity, it was evident that he must at last be overpowered, and the nobles around Prince John implored him with one voice to throw down his warder, and to save so brave a knight from the disgrace of being overcome by odds. "Not I, by the light of heaven," answered Prince John. "This same springald, who conceals his name and despises our proffered hospitality, hath already gained one prize, and may now afford to let others have their turn." As he spoke thus, an unexpected incident changed the fortune of the day. There was among the ranks of the Disinherited Knight a champion in black armour, mounted on a black horse, large of size, tall, and to all appearance powerful and strong, like the rider by whom he was mounted. This knight, who bore on his shield no device of any kind, had hitherto evinced very little interest in the event of the fight, beating off with seeming ease those combatants who attacked him, but neither pursuing his advantages nor himself assailing any one. In short, he had hitherto acted the part rather of a spectator than of a party in the tournament, a circumstance which procured him among the spectators the name of Le Noir Faineant, or the Black Sluggard. At once this knight seemed to throw aside his apathy, when he discovered the leader of his party so hard bested, for, setting spurs to his horse, which was quite fresh, he came to his assistance like a thunderbolt, exclaiming in a voice like a trumpet call, "Desdicado, to the rescue!" It was high time, for while the Disinherited Knight was pressing upon the Templar, Front de Bœuf had got nigh to him with his uplifted sword. But ere the blow could descend, the sable knight dealt a stroke on his head, which, glancing from the polished helmet, lighted with violence scarcely abated on the chamfron of the steed, and Front de Bœuf rolled on the ground, both horse and man equally stunned by the fury of the blow. Le Noir Faineant then turned his horse upon Athelstane of Coningsburgh, and his own sword having been broken in his encounter with Front de Bœuf, he wrenched from the hand of the bulky Saxon the battle-axe which he wielded, and, like one familiar with the use of the weapon, bestowed him such a blow upon the crest that Athelstane also lay senseless on the field. Having achieved this double feat, for which he was the more highly applauded that it was totally unexpected from him, the knight seemed to resume the sluggishness of his character, returning calmly to the northern extremity of the lists, leaving his leader to cope as best he could with the Brian de Bois Guilbert. This was no longer matter of so much difficulty as formerly. The Templar's horse had bled much, and gave way under the shock of the Disinherited Knight's charge. Brian de Bois Guilbert rolled on the field, encumbered with the stirrup from which he was unable to draw his foot. His antagonist sprung from horseback, waved his fatal sword over the head of his adversary, and commanded him to yield himself. When Prince John, more moved by the Templar's dangerous situation than he had been by that of his rival, saved him the mortification of confessing himself vanquished, by casting down his warder, and putting an end to the conflict. It was, indeed, only the relics and embers of the fight which continued to burn; for of the few knights who still continued in the lists, the greater part had, by tacit consent, forborne the conflict for some time, leaving it to be determined by the strife of the leaders. The squires, who had found it a matter of danger and difficulty to attend their masters during the engagement, now thronged into the lists to pay their dutiful attendance to the wounded, who were removed with the utmost care and attention to the neighbouring pavilions, or the quarters prepared for them in the adjoining village. Thus ended the memorable field of Ashby de la Zouche, one of the most gallantly contested tournaments of that age, for although only 4 knights, including one who was smothered by the heat of his armour, had died upon the field, yet upwards of 30 were desperately wounded, 4 or 5 of whom never recovered. Several more were disabled for life, and those who escaped best carried the marks of the conflict to the grave with them. Hence it is always mentioned in the old records as the gentle and joyous passage of arms of Ashby. It being now the duty of Prince John to name the knight who had done best, he determined that the honour of the day remained with the knight whom the popular voice had termed Le Noir Faineant. It was pointed out to the Prince, in impeachment of this decree, that the victory had been in fact won by the Disinherited Knight, who, in the course of the day, had overcome 6 champions with his own hand, and who had finally unhorsed and struck down the leader of the opposite party. But Prince John adhered to his own opinion, on the ground that the Disinherited Knight and his party had lost the day but for the powerful assistance of the Knight of the Black Armour, to whom, therefore, he persisted in awarding the prize. To the surprise of all present, however, the knight thus preferred was nowhere to be found. He had left the lists immediately when the conflict ceased, and had been observed by some spectators to move down one of the forest glades with the same slow pace and listless and indifferent manner which had procured him the epithet of the Black Sluggard. After he had been summoned twice by the sound of trumpet and proclamation of the heralds, it became necessary to name another to receive the honours which had been assigned to him. Prince John had now no further excuse for resisting the claim of the Disinherited Knight, whom, therefore, he named the champion of the day. Through a field slippery with blood, and encumbered with broken armour and the bodies of slain and wounded horses, the marshals of the lists again conducted the victor to the foot of Prince John's throne. "Disinherited Knight," said Prince John, "since by that title only you will consent to be known to us, we a second time award to you the honours of this tournament, and announce to you your right to claim and receive from the hands of the Queen of Love and Beauty the chaplet of honour which your valour has justly deserved." The knight bowed low and gracefully, but returned no answer. While the trumpets sounded, while the heralds strained their voices in proclaiming honour to the brave and glory to the victor, while ladies waved their silken kerchiefs and embroidered veils, and while all ranks joined in a clamorous shout of exultation, the marshals conducted the Disinherited Knight across the lists to the foot of that throne of honour which was occupied by the Lady Rowena. On the lower step of this throne the champion was made to kneel down. Indeed, his whole action since the fight had ended seemed rather to have been upon the impulse of those around him than from his own free will, and it was observed that he tottered as they guided him the second time across the lists. Rowena, descending from her station with a graceful and dignified step, was about to place the chaplet which she held in her hand upon the helmet of the champion, when the marshals exclaimed with one voice, "It must not be thus. His head must be bare." The knight muttered faintly a few words, which were lost in the hollow of his helmet, but their purport seemed to be a desire that his casque might not be removed. Whether from love of form or from curiosity, the marshals paid no attention to his expressions of reluctance, but unhelmed him by cutting the laces of his casque, and undoing the fastening of his gorget. When the helmet was removed, the well-formed yet sun-burnt features of a young man of 25 were seen, amidst a profusion of short fair hair. His countenance was as pale as death, and marked in one or two places with streaks of blood. Rowena had no sooner beheld him than she uttered a faint shriek, but at once summoning up the energy of her disposition, and compelling herself, as it were, to proceed, while her frame yet trembled with the violence of sudden emotion, she placed upon the drooping head of the victor the splendid chaplet, which was the destined reward of the day, and pronounced in a clear and distinct tone these words: "I bestow on thee this chaplet, Sir Knight, as the meed and valour assigned to this day's victor." Here she paused a moment, and then firmly added, "And upon brows more worthy could a wreath of chivalry never be placed." The knight stooped his head and kissed the hand of the lovely sovereign, by whom his valour had been rewarded, and then, sinking yet farther forward, lay prostrate at her feet. There was a general consternation. Cedric, who had been struck mute by the sudden appearance of his banished son, now rushed forward, as if to separate him from Rowena. But this had already been accomplished by the marshals of the field, who, guessing the cause of Ivanhoe's swoon, had hastened to undo his armour, and found that the head of a lance had penetrated his breastplate, and inflicted a wound in his side. Chapter 12.